You've heard the term start with the end in mind, and this definitely applies to large capital projects, particularly related to commissioning. What does this mean? This means that you actually need to include commissioning upfront in EPC contracts before they're even awarded. The full definition of the rules of the game in how projects are going to be completed need to be defined upfront in EPC contracts before they're even signed. Listen to this episode to learn about the 8 clauses that are required in EPC contracts for commissioning success.
You're listening to the Industrial Commissioning Association podcast, where we discuss best practices for industrial plant process and energy system commissioning. Get ready to say no to outdated industry norms and say yes to improved project performance. Here's your host, Paul Turner.
Welcome, everyone. Have you ever wondered why is the transition from construction to commissioning so difficult? Why does it usually end up in delays and confusion? Well, there's one primary main reason for that is the transition from area-based construction to systems-based completion was not defined properly in contracts. So we're going to get that fixed for you today and show you how to structure your EPC contracts for a smooth transition from construction to commissioning. And we do that with the 8 commissioning clauses that are required in EPC contracts to allow that to happen. Essentially, commissioning is testing at the end of projects is one part of commissioning, but we need to start with the end in mind. And that starts with writing the proper contracts at the beginning of projects so that we can have a strong finish at the end. So if you haven't already, be sure to join the Industrial Commissioning Association. You can become a member or get a copy of the ICA Global Commissioning Standard and get access to a lot of the resources that we're going to talk about today in this presentation. You can join at icxa.net/join, and I'll see you there. And as I'm going through the presentation, if you have any questions, shoot them in the chat. So why is it important that commissioning must be defined in contracts when we're not defining properly upfront in contracts for construction completions and commissioning? When these aren't contractually defined in contracts, then it always leads to cowboy commissioning in the end. There's no structure, there's no process. And we need to be using contracts as a tool not only to start projects, but also as a tool to finish projects. So it's important to define what that finish looks like in how we're going to complete commissioning at the end of projects. When this isn't defined in contracts and there is no definition of how construction is going to be completed, then it always impacts the project timelines, right? There's always delays. There's always misaligned expectations between construction groups and commissioning groups. And we need to set the stage early in projects with alignment and agreement. And that starts with contracts. When contracts are weak in construction elements, then that leads to poor construction quality. And of course, if we're not getting quality assets from our construction counterparts, then we're not going to be able to proceed very effectively in commissioning. We get incomplete system handovers, and it always leads to budget overruns. It's the classic story on projects, right, where everything is compressed at the end. And that's because it wasn't defined properly upfront in contracts. When things do go wrong and there are delays on site and poor quality or other things, then there's no contractual recourse when things go wrong if contracts weren't set up properly in the beginning. So let's get our contracts set up early and set up properly because they define the rules of the game and how we're going to finish the project. So one thing's for sure is we do need to allow contractors to have their means and methods, right? Once the contract is signed, then construction groups, they are entitled to their means and methods. That's how the contracts work, and we need to allow them to do that. And it's always a bad idea to direct your contractor, right? That always leads into lots of problems, and we certainly don't want to do that. So if you can't direct the contractor and the contractor is entitled to their own means and methods, then how do you get what you need for commissioning? Well, the way to do that is to define that in the contract before contracts are signed. And you can write your contracts as put whatever in there that you want, right? It's a signed agreement between the owner and the construction groups. That's how you define what you need for commissioning, is in contracts, not after the fact. So this is an upfront effort, and one of the primary main reasons that construction folks need to be involved in projects early is to align on the rules of the game in contracts so we can have a strong finish in the end. The goal here, of course, is we want to be working collaboratively with all groups on projects, including the construction group and everyone else, right? So we want to avoid any misunderstandings. We want to avoid any disputes. And we need to define this all up front in the contract for how we're going to finish the project during commissioning. When we look at contracts kind of after the fact for things that have gone wrong, it always stems down to a poor definition of the construction completions phase. When we look in contracts, they're usually pretty light on details in what this transition from area-based construction to systems-based completion looks like. The concept might exist is that we need to focus on system-based completions for commissioning, but it's rarely ever defined very well in contracts for what that is and what that even means, or how construction groups are even supposed to work and complete their work to align with systems-based completions. And as you know, if it's not in the contract, then it's not going to happen. So we need to define this very critical phase of construction completions in contracts so that everyone on the project knows exactly what that transition is going to look like. What is that transition from area-based construction to systems-based completion? Now, this figure is right out of the ICA Global Commissioning Standard. This is figure 1 out of ICA 001, and you can get a copy of the standard. You can download this commissioning phases and handover model. And this presentation is going to focus on the contract requirements in EPC construction contracts in order to make this construction completions phase take place much smoother on your projects. So what is the construction completion phase? I'm sure you've heard of construction on projects, but there's a very definitive phase at the end of construction called construction completions. And it's very specific, and it's a very necessary stage defined in the ICA Global Commissioning Standard, the commissioning phases and handover model that I just went through there. So when projects are approximately 60 to 70% complete is when this transition needs to take place from area-based construction to systems-based completion. And if your construction completions aren't defined in your contract, then they're not going to happen, because construction groups are entitled to their own means and methods, right? And if it's not defined in contracts, it's not going to happen that way. And of course, it's only human nature. It's natural that construction groups are going to optimize for their construction activities, which may not align with systems-based completions. So if it's not defined in contracts, it'll never be completed that way, and it will never align with what's required for commissioning. So how does this work? This is figure 1 out of the 5th volume of the ICA Global Commissioning Standard, and this defines this transition from area-based construction to systems-based completion. So projects start out in the build phase, of course. And this is where construction groups are working on their civil, their structural, their general installation activities. They're optimized for equipment deliveries. They're optimized for large workforces and coordination, and that often means that construction is planned by area. And that makes sense. Construction groups have their means and methods to do that, and we want them to optimize their construction efforts in the best methods for them to complete their work, right? So that will mean that they will plan their work by area, and that's all good. Then as the work progresses, and like I said, at 60 or 70% complete, that work by area needs to transition to a systems-based completion process to align with the systems that are required for static commissioning and dynamic commissioning. So this is transitioning to systems-based completions around the electrical, mechanical, and automation equipment that's needed for the function of each system. So from the build phase, projects then move into the construction completion phase, which is construction groups completing their work by system. So this is the phase of projects where they'll be completing AITR check sheets to verify quality control processes and the installations are correct. This is where some of this early verification would take place for flushing, pressure, leak testing, point-to-point mega checks, anything that would be defined in an AITR checklist is performed by the construction group leading up to the construction completion milestone. So then this is a transition where construction groups will hand over by system to the commissioning group. This is the construction completion milestone that is achieved, and then the formal transfer of care, custody, and control from the construction group to the commissioning group. And this all needs to be defined in contracts or it's not going to happen, right? So why is this transition so difficult? It's the classic problem on projects, right? Is this transition is unorganized and things are delayed. There's misalignment between construction and commissioning groups. There's disputes in the field. Nobody can agree. And when we look at contracts, 9 times out of 10, it's always because construction completions are poorly defined in EPC contracts. Or worse, when you look in the contract, there's no definition at all. Everybody wrote the contract years ago, and nobody was in that mindset of thinking, let's put the right things in here to finish the project. Everybody's more focused on awarding contracts to get the job started, and commissioning gets missed, right? So with no definition at all of construction completions, then it's a free-for-all at the end of projects in how construction groups are going to complete their work. And when it's not defined in contracts, then it's a gamble. You'll get something different every time from construction groups because it was just so poorly defined in contracts. So the typical approach, I'm sure you've been on projects like this, is that commissioning groups are involved too late in projects, right? Commissioning groups will in the typical approach, join a project after construction contracts are already awarded. And in those contracts, there was no definition of systems-based completion. So the damage is already done before construction groups are even part of the project. The commissioning groups arrive at site late and then most of the way through construction, and then they start suggesting late stage changes, right? Is okay, well, we need this system here, we need this changed here, we need a focus on this area. Well, the construction groups are never pleased with that, right? They've already established their long equipment lead times, and equipment is arriving at site to align with how they've planned their work. They've already planned their large workforces, and they're engaged in the construction activities on site. And then this discussion with commissioning groups showing up later always causes disputes and always causes delays in the field because there was no alignment in contracts earlier when they were first signed. So we avoid this mismatch in expectations by making sure that these 8 key commissioning clauses are included in construction contracts before contracts are awarded. And this is part of the procurement package that is put together when selecting construction groups to perform the work. So this is all defined in the ICA Global Commissioning Standard. You can get a copy of the standard, and all of these 8 key commissioning clauses are defined in there. You can get a copy and get even more details on what we're talking about here. And everything that we're talking about is in addition to all the technical commissioning requirements. Of course, you need all the detailed design elements and all of the testing or technical aspects of commissioning that's required. That's a given, and that's throughout the contract everywhere. These 8 key commissioning clauses that we're talking about are in addition to all of the technical commissioning requirements. These 8 key aspects are related to the commercial elements and the project management elements of commissioning that are required in contracts that are often missing in a lot of contracts. So the first element of the 8 to include is clarity on scope and responsibility, right? And no surprise there, that's pretty straightforward. You always need clear roles and responsibilities for anything that you do, and commissioning is no different, right? We need to know who is doing what at the end of the project, not when contracts are awarded, but how is this transition going to take place later on projects, in what is construction doing and what is commissioning doing during this transition? So this is defined in your division of responsibility matrix. This gives you a clear, crystal clear definition of what each construction completion milestone looks like and who's responsible for what. It's difficult when the lines between construction and commissioning are blurred. And I can't recommend any more strongly that you cannot blur the lines between construction and commissioning. As soon as you blur that very clear construction completion milestone, then it's very confusing on who's responsible for what. Because what does construction complete explicitly mean? When you're writing a contract at the beginning, it seems straightforward, right? Complete construction, then we'll go test some stuff. No big deal, right? But everybody's definition of complete on projects always means something different. I guarantee you that complete to the construction folks means something entirely different than complete to the commissioning folks. And it's misaligned right from the beginning because it wasn't explicitly defined in that very distinct construction completion milestone objective for what complete actually means. When that is defined up front in contracts, though, construction groups have a much clearer, a very crystal clear view of the construction goalposts that they need to achieve, and everything's aligned right from the beginning in contract rather than trying to dispute that out in the field later. So this is figure 4 in ICA 005 of the ICA Global Commissioning Standard, and this gives the very explicit definition of this very important milestone for construction complete on projects, in what takes place earlier for construction and construction completions in our AITR check sheets. And then when that construction completion milestone is obtained, what takes place by commissioning groups afterwards in BITR check sheets. And I've seen this made such a mess on projects because this wasn't well defined or it's messed up. And we've defined this in the ICA Global Commissioning Standard very explicitly so that there's no reason for confusion anymore on what takes place during each of these phases and what takes place during this complex transition on projects. So I encourage you to follow this. This is the best practice. This is the standard approach on projects. If you try and change things or mix things up here, then it only causes confusion on projects. And wouldn't it be really nice if this was the same on all projects? There was a standard approach on what this transition looked like so that everybody knew upfront what they're responsible for, even before joining the project. So this definition is very important and needs some very explicit attention in defining this in your contract, and I'm going to show you how. So this is the Division of Responsibility template. We've got two templates. If you log into the Industrial Commissioning Association members area, you can download either one of these templates. There's a template for if the EPC is responsible for commissioning, which can present its own challenges, but for where the EPC is responsible for construction and then hand over to the commissioning group, there's a DOR template in there as well. So don't reinvent the wheel, just go get this template. You can then take it, modify it, make it specific to your projects. All of the commissioning management deliverables are listed in this Division of Responsibility matrix. All of the groups on the right-hand side here are marked what they're responsible for. So get a copy of these templates and use them as a starting point and make them specific to your projects. That'll help you a lot in what's required to include in your EPC contracts for your DOR templates. So the second aspect, again, no surprise, is quality. We need to be receiving quality systems from construction. And if it's not defined in contracts, then it's pretty tough to get quality, right? So you would think this is straightforward, that you need to include in contracts all the specific quality requirements. But I've been on projects where in the submittal list, there was no request to receive the construction group's quality management plan. So if you're not asking for quality in the contract, then it's pretty tough to get quality in the field. So proper construction quality management system processes and reviewing contractors' plan for quality right in their proposal submission, right up front when contractors are being evaluated during the procurement process to select contractors. That needs to be evaluated as part of the proposal selection. But then not only having a solid document that defines how they're going to manage quality, but actually confirming that their field processes and documentation in the field align with what's in the document. It's no use having a document on the shelf if it's not being followed in the field. So typically quality audits are a good idea to confirm that what's actually in the document is actually what's being executed in the field for construction quality control processes. And then what does quality assurance oversight look like to ensure that construction groups are following the quality processes that they're supposed to? So what oversight processes are taking place in the field to ensure that the QMS is being adhered to? So this, again, would seem straightforward. We need quality, but when it's not defined in the contract, then it's unlikely to happen in the field. So this is probably the most important one in defining how this transition is going to take place in EPC contracts, is the integrated schedule between construction and commissioning, because this defines the sequence of system handovers and when construction groups need to complete each of their construction completion packages. So when contracts are being defined, certainly the system specifics aren't going to exactly be known, right? You're not going to have a very specific tag list of exactly what to include in your EPC contract, because that will come out from some of the detailed design activities. But you will certainly have a high-level system definition and the sequence of system handovers. I would say that if you don't know the systems that are being built when you're putting together your EPC contract, then you're probably not ready to move forward and designing and building the project if you don't yet know what you're going to be building. So we certainly know that we're going to have a power auxiliary power system. We may know we're going to have a chemical dosing system. We would know those things at a high level, right? Maybe we know that we're going to have 8 different chemical dosing subsystems. So that definition is essential to include in contracts, is we need chemical dosing system 3 before we need chemical dosing system number 6. And that high level definition certainly needs to go in contracts in that sequence of system handovers that are required. So construction groups know how to plan and complete their work in alignment with what's required for static commissioning and dynamic commissioning. You may have heard of the term plan projects from right to left. Well, this is exactly how you do that, is in the contract. So the concept would be, if you're thinking about your Primavera P6 schedule, is starting on the right? You've got your project in service date. What do you need to do to achieve your project in service date? Well, you need a startup and energization sequence that meets your project in service date. Okay, well, what do we need for our startup and energization sequence? We need some items commissioned, and we've got our commissioning sequence to go through there. What do we need to achieve our commissioning sequence? We need some construction completions in that sequence to align with commissioning sequence. And that early project planning and definition in your EPC contract is how you define that sequence of construction completions, and explicitly define that in your EPC contract so that construction groups know the sequence and details of each system completion to identically align with your commissioning and startup sequence to meet your project in service date. And this is what this will look like. This is right out of the ICA Global Commissioning Standard as well. All of the system definitions that are on your project will be going through various stages of your gated commissioning workflows at various stages of completion. So while some systems are early starting static completion, other portions of the project are still under construction. But as each system is progressed through these sequences, you end up with a series of construction completion milestones. So CC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you'll have a sequence of all of these construction completion dates defined in contracts explicitly in the order that are required for construction completions to align with your commissioning and startup sequence. So the fourth aspect to include in construction contracts is to define what each system-based completion actually is with an associated payment milestone. So this includes, what are the physical assets that are part of that handover? And maybe the part that gets missed the most is, what are the documentation deliverables that are associated with each of these system handovers? So what is the very specific, explicit definition of complete in order for contractors to get paid to achieve each of those system handovers? Because like I said, everybody's definition of complete always seems to mean something different, right? And if you have misaligned expectations in your contracts, then it's going to be pretty tough to sort out later and lots of disputes in the field. And it's important also to include backloaded payment milestones with each of these construction completion milestones and each milestone of your staged gate commissioning sequence as well. There's certainly a balance. We need to provide the necessary payment milestones up front so contractors have payments for equipment procurements and installation, but we can't forget about the back-end payment milestones as well through our commissioning sequence to make sure that there's enough percentage still remaining for each of these commissioning milestones so that contractors remain motivated to achieve these completions in the end. When defining your payment milestones, it's very important to define what is required at each construction completion milestone for payment to be released. And it needs to be very explicit in contracts, because everybody will overlook and say, well, we don't have the O&M manual yet, but let's proceed anyways and still achieve the payment milestones. When it's defined explicitly upfront in contracts and what payment constitutes, it's much easier to enforce in the field. And this is easily all known when EPC contracts are being put together. These aren't magical things that appear later in the project. We know what these are, right? We know we need some red line drawing markups. We know we need construction quality data for flushing reports and pressure leak test reports, point-to-point check sheets, mega check sheets, all those good things, all of the construction ITRs completed, factory acceptance test results, any settings files, O&M manuals, categorized punch lists, all of these things. We know that these are all required, and to list them out explicitly and say that they're part of each absolute requirement, part of each construction completion milestone with an associated payment, then it makes it very clear on what's required to complete each system and achieve that payment milestone. On most projects that I've been on, the money usually motivates, right? So tying these things to a payment milestone and an actual construction completion sign off in our commissioning software usually gets everybody's attention. I think I've only been part of one project where contractor had the payment milestones didn't motivate them and money wasn't motivating them. But in most cases, the construction groups are motivated by the money. So tie it to a payment milestone, and that should get some attention for sure. So the fifth element that is important to include in EPC contracts is your CMS interface. So this is your CMS software. And how are your gated commissioning workflows defined in your commissioning software, and how will this be used for completing the project? Not only that we're going to be using commissioning software, but what are the specific gated milestones that apply to your specific project, and how are these going to be enforced in the field? How are these modeled and tracked in your CMS software? And when you're preparing your EPC contract, you may not know the specific name of your software. Maybe there's still a selection process to take place, but the workflows that you will follow, those are known for sure. And those must be identified in contracts with the particular CMS software, maybe to be identified a little bit later in the process. But these workflows are all known upfront and need to be defined in contracts, indicating that CMS software will be used to manage and track each of these workflows. It's also important to define what is the contractor's responsibility to interact with this CMS software. So construction groups will show up with their own software, if that's Procore or whatever document management system they use, and we need to allow them to use their own systems. But as construction is making that transition at 60 or 70% complete, what are the expectations for contractors to be using the specific project CMS software interface? Are they expected to have one CMS admin interfacing with the software? Will it be everyone on the project that's expected to use the CMS software? How about vendors that are only with the project maybe for a few weeks or short months? Are they expected to use the CMS software? Will documents be scanned and uploaded in the software, or will contracts to define how AITR check sheets are completed directly in the software? So this needs to be defined in contracts. If you try and say later in the project that you're going to be using CMS software, of course, there's going to be resistance to that because the construction groups have their own software already and they don't want to use another tool. So this needs to be defined upfront in contracts if there's an expectation to be using CMS software for construction completions and commissioning. The sixth element to include is the transition at each construction completion milestone in how the roles change. So up to construction completion milestone, contractors are, of course, leading all the activities, but the roles change at construction completion, right? The contractor is no longer leading those activities for that particular system or that particular area. That transitions to the commissioning team, where they're then responsible for leading the activities in that specific area. So what commissioning support is required after each construction completion milestone is achieved? So what's required for punch list closeout? How are construction groups required to request access to areas that are under a commissioning group's responsibilities? Is there any field resources that are required from construction groups to support any of the testing or startup activities? Is there any need or requirement for construction groups to help assemble any temporary test setups that are needed for particular commissioning sequences? And if there are issues that are discovered as we go through commissioning, how are these addressed by construction groups? This all needs to be defined in what are the roles and responsibilities before construction completion and after construction completion to make sure that we have the support needed to continue with commissioning. The seventh element to include in contracts is contract performance management. So we all do our best efforts to select the best and the brightest, the most standout construction groups on projects, but that doesn't always happen, right? And sometimes we end up with an underperforming contractor. So what is the method to rectify any incomplete system handovers? If we've very explicitly defined what makes up each construction completion handover, but those objectives aren't being achieved, then how is this addressed in contracts to rectify any incomplete system handovers? Who has the final decision authority on what things are actually complete. So we want to avoid disputes. And if there is still a dispute in a sign off of a particular system, then how is that addressed? Who is the final decision-making authority to say, no, this isn't complete and we must finish this before this system can move to the next stage? How are issues escalated and how are recovery plans implemented if we end up with an underperforming contractor? And then the last item, of course, we need to focus on health, safety, security, and environment. And during this transition and some of our startup activities, commissioning does play a big role in project safety. Earlier in the project, even for HAZOP, HAZID, the PSSR processes that we're putting in place, the commissioning team is relied on heavily to make sure that all of these startups are taking place safely. So we need to be evaluating the construction group's safety when they're being evaluated during procurement processes to ensure that they're going to align with what's required for commissioning safety later in the project. In most cases, construction groups are much more familiar working in a non-energized facility, right, with construction activities taking place. But towards their end of their activities, as we're starting up some of these familiar facilities, they will be working around an energized facility with additional hazards that they're maybe not as familiar with, given that they're more familiar with working in a construction environment. And the bulk of construction work is performed in a non-operational environment, right? So the commissioning folks are relied on heavily to keep everyone safe as the site transitions from a construction facility to an operational facility. How is this defined in contracts to make sure that everyone stays safe? So these are the 8 key critical elements to include in construction contracts to define our construction completion phases. And when I look in most contracts, I don't see these items. And it's clear why there's challenges in the field because nothing was defined up front to get alignment on what this transition is going to look like. And when it's not defined in contracts, then you're entirely relying on the people processes and whether or not groups understand systems-based completion or whether they're have never worked in that environment and have no intention of meeting systems-based completion because it was not assigned in contracts. So we need to make sure that when we're selecting construction groups, we're selecting qualified contractors that actually understand systems-based completion and can align with commissioning's needs. And if I can add one last thing here is please follow a proven procurement process. There's no reason to make up a homemade procurement process or a homemade contract structure because procurement is a solved problem. There's processes out there to follow already that are proven processes and have that work really well. I've had lots of success with a FIDIC contract structure. There's others out there as well, but do not use a homemade procurement process when selecting your contractors. This is a solved problem, so don't try and reinvent the wheel. There's decades of lessons learned experience in these procurement processes and contract structures, and even though you might feel that your project is a unique special snowflake, I assure you that it's not, and that these proven processes that have been used for decades need to be followed to implement our projects and our contracts on site so that we can follow a process that has proven success. So the goal here, of course, is when we're writing our EPC contracts, we need all phases of projects to be aligned, right? Engineering, procurement, construction, all of this needs to be defined in contracts with commissioning needs in mind, right? Working in silos is never going to work on projects. We want all groups to be aligned, and that's done when contracts are written at the beginning of projects. The contracts are the rules of the game and how this is going to take place. And getting that alignment upfront in contracts is essential for all groups to be able to work together and successfully complete in the end. We need to be planning for a smooth transition from construction to commissioning, and that starts before contracts are even awarded so that we can plan for a safe and efficient startup on our projects. So I've got a few additional resources here to help you as well. We've just launched our brand new course series. This is the leading edge commissioning processes on projects, all based on the ICA Global Commissioning Standard. So check those out if you need any help or support in filling in any of the gaps on your commissioning processes. There's strategy and planning courses in there, processes on digitalizing your commissioning workflows, all of the stages of the ICA Global Commissioning Standard. So everything that would be seen in the commissioning phases and handover model that we looked at earlier, there's a course module that focuses on each section, because I think from this presentation, you can see that technical skills alone will not get you to commissioning success, right? Everything we've talked about here are the commercial aspects of commissioning and the project management aspects of commissioning. So there's lots of skill sets that are required for successful commissioning in the end. For all of the strategy and planning elements that are required for commissioning, for digitalizing your commissioning process, for your data management throughout all stages of the project, what's required off-site for factory acceptance testing, construction completions was a large focus of this discussion as well, your on-site testing workflows, your project handover in service, lessons learned, commissioning safety. There's something in there for everything. So you can check that out at icxa.net/store if you want to sharpen any of your skill sets in there. So like I mentioned at the beginning, if you don't have the ICA Global Commissioning Standard, definitely get a copy because it's a cutting edge document that will help you on your project. So you can get a copy at icxa.net/join. We also found this single page brochure very helpful if you want to check it out for discussions with your, say, your project manager. They don't necessarily want to see all 9 volumes of the standard. A single page brochure is often good for some of those discussions. You can get it at icxa.net/brochure. So definitely check out those resources. Those will help you on your projects for sure. And I do this presentation every week, so hope to see you next week as well. And I'm happy to answer your questions. Can we get the PowerPoint on site? So this recording is definitely available. It's live streamed on LinkedIn and a few other places. You can definitely access it. You can download it, share it with others. And that gives you the presentation, the video, the slide presentation, everything that you need. Definitely use it as a discussion point with others on your project. Help them understand what's required to start with the end in mind and start contracts in the right method here. So, yep, you can get access to all of that. Hello, Clint. Good to see you. I got your phone message yesterday, so I'm glad you were able to join. I trust you found that this was helpful. Permission to share. Absolutely. Yep. Share this information. That's one of the primary objectives of the Industrial Commissioning Association, is to get this commissioning information in the hands of as many people as possible. So by all means, share the standard, share this presentation, help people understand the importance of commissioning on projects, because commissioning is just not well understood in the industry, and it's hurting our ability to complete projects. So absolutely share this in as many places as possible. And if there's anything I can do to help you share some information, please let me know. That's the goal here, is to help people understand commissioning. Should the balance of plant be considered a predecessor milestone for commissioning? That is a good question. I would say that does depend, because I would say they're largely overlapping activities. So something like balance of plant, something like the security system, for example, or maybe even the fire detection system. Some of these systems we don't necessarily even want enabled until we're kind of in later stages of commissioning. If we're still going through hazardous activities that are generating smoke or cutting steel or whatever, having the fire detection system as a predecessor milestone, and maybe enabled or not is the question, can cause issues. But I think it's a case-by-case basis in how you're planning your commissioning sequence for each balance of plant item and each larger system that's being commissioned as well. Certainly some of the balance of plant items like auxiliary power, lighting, if we're working in Northern Canada where it's -40, we need some heat on for sure. So certainly some of those balance of plants items will be required, but some of the other ones might come a bit later. So it depends maybe on your overall commissioning sequence and how you plan that out. Certainly all of the commissioning of those aspects could be, all the balance of plant items could be complete. Maybe we're just not enabling them quite yet. We're not enabling the security system quite yet because doors are still being held open by construction folks or commissioning folks, and we don't want a whole bunch of nuisance alarms. So it depends in how you map out that sequence. Hi, Peter. Good to see you. This is my favorite subject. This is my favorite subject too. This is the heart of what sets the projects up for success, is the rules of the game right at the beginning. And if we don't get this right at the beginning, then it's pretty tough to have success later, right? It just ends up in that brute force, bang your head against the wall process because there was no alignment right at the beginning. Now, I will also say that this is very challenging, right? And it's a problem on projects, as the commissioning folks are involved too late in projects, and they're busy on other projects. To get them involved earlier on projects to write contracts, it's just not in everybody's mindset on projects for sure. But this is what's required to be successful on projects, is to engage commissioning folks early and have them involved in writing contracts. Because to be fair, your legal group or your procurement group, your engineering group, your project management group, they don't have this commissioning expertise and they can't figure it out, right? They need the expert commissioning folks participating in these processes to make sure that the right aspects of commissioning are included in contracts. So it's a group effort for sure. And commissioning, that's why commissioning folks need to be involved earlier, is to set these rules of the game early in projects for success later. It follows that the scope for each subsystem and system needs to be clearly defined in the RFQs that are issued to the construction contractors to enable them to look at quantities and resources to commit to the sectional completion dates milestones. This can be very challenging, even for major EPCs or IOCs. Absolutely, yep. And it's not the construction mindset, right? It's very natural that they want to complete their work in the most optimized manner specific to construction. Imposing this construction completions at the end throws that optimization out a little bit, right? And maybe isn't their optimal sequence in how they want to complete the work, but is essential for proper alignment between construction and commissioning. So we need to work with construction groups and help them understand this systems-based completion mindset, because it's not a natural thought process. And that's why defining it earlier in contracts makes it much easier for them to understand and plan and align their work, because naturally they will plan their work in other manner than system-based completions. But defining it up in contracts makes it crystal clear for them to have 100% of the knowledge required to successfully plan their work and align with what's required for later stages of the project. Super important topic. Paul, gotta run. Great to see you, Darren. Hope to see you next time. Always appreciate your support. Great. Yeah, absolutely. Share it with everybody. Happy to share. Let me know if there's any ways that I can help. Is there any involvement required for ORA team for CSU, ORA operational readiness? Definitely, the two processes are taking place in parallel for commissioning and operational readiness. Sometimes it's even the same group. Often it's a different group, but they work hand in hand, right? Because a lot of the deliverables that are coming out of commissioning are needed for operational readiness. And on the reciprocal, the best thing that plant operators can do is get involved early and participate in the commissioning process. As we're going through some of the static commissioning or dynamic commissioning activities, that's the best time for operators to see the systems, talk to the experts, see the troubleshooting, and learn and experience in the field, so that at the project and service date, they have a lot more level of comfort in operating the new facilities. So definitely overlap and interrelated, and all groups need to support each other in this transition from construction to commissioning to operations, so that we can support a smooth transition into routine operation and maintenance by getting our operational teams operational ready for their new roles. When the EPC is subcontracting commissioning, would you say that the definitions of handovers and all we've discussed today should be part of the commissioning plan for the EPC to include in contracts? This isn't my most favorite model, is to have the EPC also subcontracting commissioning activities, because essentially you have the construction group and the commissioning group reporting to the same group. It sets up a conflict of interest where essentially you have the construction group verifying their own work. Now, I know this is common on projects. It just requires an even more scrutiny when preparing the upfront EPC contract, and a very more precise oversight to ensure that the EPC contract is executed correctly, right? At the end of the project, it's challenging for sure, as construction is taken a lot of the time, commissioning gets squeezed. So even that commissioning subcontractor is squeezed at the end of the project. That's what leads to shortcuts, right? My much preferred model is to have construction groups focus on what they're great at, is construction, and then have a separate owner-led contract to lead commissioning. But regardless, if that is the model, I guess that technically that would be an EPCC model, where the same group is doing construction and commissioning. Everything we've talked about today still applies. It's just an internal process that the EPC contractor has to manage. And that's where things can fall apart, right? Is because the EPC contractors are very good at construction. This isn't necessarily their strength or expertise, is this transition and commissioning. And if they don't have an upfront effort or rock solid internal processes to manage this transition that we've talked about today, then things can still fall apart in making this transition, right? So definitely in requesting that plan from the EPC, all of this needs to be included in there. Maybe not to the same level of visibility, but you at least need some assurance that the EPC understands systems-based completion and is managing this transition between their two groups, whether that be a subcontractor for a commissioning group. You want to see this in their commissioning plan to make sure that they actually do understand this. I would actually, if that's the model being pursued, I would want to see that in the proposal stage to make sure that the group that I'm awarding this to actually understands systems-based completion in evaluating what their plan is as part of the contract process. You would even then, if you're using the FIDIC structure, put that commissioning plan in the contract, signed in the contract, to show that this is their plan and this is what they're going to follow, to evaluate that this group is going to actually perform as you're expected to manage these handovers. Because if that's not discussed up front when you're awarding contracts, you award the contract to a group that knows nothing about this, well, that's going to be problems later for sure, right? So that would definitely be a highly weighted evaluation criteria I would include in your procurement package for your EPC, to request that plan up front and see that they actually understand this. Proper definition of project turnover flow chart along with DOR would be beneficial since the beginning of EPC contracts. It's essential. I would say that you can't award an EPC contract without knowing all of those details up front. If you're awarding contracts to a group that doesn't understand any of this, then you're going to have lots of problems later. So I wouldn't say it's just beneficial. I would say it is 100% essential. And the procurement processes that I've been part of have all requested this information up front to see these turnovers. The DOR is part of the signed EPC contract, so that this is all defined up front. That's where we run into problems, is doing this stuff later and trying to figure it out after contracts awarded. And that's what we want to avoid, because that always leads to problems 9 out of 10 times. All right, lots of good questions. The main point, there's only one thing that you take out of this presentation. It's to start with the end in mind, right? And that means starting with commissioning before contracts are even awarded. If your EPC contract is signed and you haven't figured out any of this stuff, your project is already in trouble. This needs to be defined up front, and that's what the term start with the end in mind means, is set the rules for the game in contracts before they're signed. Negotiating any of this stuff after contracts are signed is a tough discussion to have, right? It's always dependent on the level of experience or engagement with your EPC contractor. And some groups are great to work with, and some have zero internal processes for how to manage this. And if you try and figure that out after the fact, you're only asking for trouble. So start with the end in mind, get involved in projects earlier, and define this in your procurement packages to define correctly in your EPC contract before it is signed. Start with the end in mind, and it's one of the main reasons that commissioning folks need to be involved in projects early, is to participate in these early processes. All of this is defined in the ICA Global Commissioning Standard. Get a copy of the standard, and it walks the commissioning handover, commissioning phases and handover model, walks through all of the stages of this process of what's required during FEED to set this up for success. If you're just joining projects later in the process and skipping all of these upfront activities for commissioning, then if your project's not set up for success right at the beginning, then it's a brute force method at the end to get through commissioning, which is never much fun. I appreciate everyone's involvement, because this is such an important topic on projects, and we need to help understand the awareness and importance of writing the right rules of the game in EPC contracts before we proceed with on-site commissioning much later in the project. So I appreciate everyone joining. If you have any questions, you need any help setting up your contracts for proper commissioning in your EPC contracts, then please shoot us a note, email us at info@icxa.net. We can help you out and get your contracts in the right order prior to awarding to construction groups. It's the most important thing you can do on projects to set your commissioning up for success. Please have a great day, and I hope to see you again at next week's live session. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. To become a member of the Industrial Commissioning Association, visit icxa.net. Members get access to commissioning standards, procurement specifications, commissioning training and certification, plus many more specialized resources to help you with commissioning of your industrial plant process and energy systems. Visit icxa.net for more information.